Hello, this is my CAS Experience political video, and I will be talking about two of the deadliest pandemics in recent memory. Pandemics have ravaged humanity since we've existed, and many stand out for their viciousness. The Plague of Antonine, Plague of Athens, Smallpox Pandemic of the Americas, the Carcolizzi Epidemic, the Black Death, and the Plague of Justinian, which killed millions in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, are just some that can be listed. The ones that I'll be talking about are the Spanish flu of 1918, a pandemic that killed an estimated 50 million to 100 million, which occurred alongside the incredibly destructive First World War, and the COVID-19 pandemic, a contemporary pandemic that might have taken the lives of up to 21 million people. Now, these two pandemics are incredibly different, and I'll be discussing their differences, but it's also important to understand that there are events that occurred during both pandemics that almost point for point seem like carbon copies of one another. When people often repeat the quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes," I think that pandemics are a wonderful embodiment of that. So this video will be structured in sort of chapters in which I talk about certain issues relating to both pandemics. First, I will be comparing the two viruses themselves, comparing the spread and press coverage of it. Second, I'll be talking about the ways in which countries, politicians, particularly in the United States but also in other countries, handle the pandemics ravaging their countries, the policies and approaches that were taken during those times and results that it would yield when it came to the death toll, sickness toll, and the way in which people behaved in regards to conspiracy, civil unrest, economic unrest, social unrest, and political division. And finally, I'll be comparing how both pandemics ended. So for segment 1, let's compare COVID-19 and the Spanish flu. Now, the Spanish flu would gain its notoriety for being far deadlier than COVID-19. The death tolls speak for themselves. Proportionally, Spanish flu killed far more Americans than COVID-19. And it would seek to kill approximately 20 million people in just India alone. It would wipe out entire communities in in islands such as Western Samoa and villages throughout Alaska. It would decimate native populations throughout the Americas, and it would even impact the outcomes of battles during the First World War. COVID-19, on the other hand, despite not being as deadly as the Spanish flu, would still prove itself to be quite formidable, as it is responsible for what is currently the greatest mass death event in the history of the U.S., as the U.S. has suffered up to 1 million deaths, more than any war or previous pandemic in history. Now let's compare the spread and initial coverage. For COVID-19, as we know it, it began in Wuhan, China in December of 2019 and was immediately on the news referred to as a mystery illness. Initially, the authoritarian government in China denied that the virus could transmit from person to person, claiming that it was under control. However, many Western countries would praise China, with some, such as President Trump, declaring that we owed President Xi Jinping a debt of gratitude for his ability to gather control of the pandemic. This gratitude would be misplaced. However, the state collected data on cases and deaths, and things were beginning to look worse by the day. In January, the virus was declared to have the ability to spread from person to person, and throughout February, the virus quickly spread to different countries, including the U.S. As it began marching towards pandemic status, countries declared it a public health emergency. However, for the most part, a lot of governments, particularly the U.S., continued to insist that the virus was under control. By this point, the death toll in China was over 200, and by March it had been declared a global pandemic, as China was no longer the country with the most deaths. That privilege had been given to Italy, as the virus was ravaging the Italian people, killing hundreds per day, as countries all over the world began long quarantines that would last for the rest of the year. In the U.S., President Trump assembled a task force consisting of several doctors, most prominently Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx. Both Fauci and Birx attempted to guide the public on measures that needed to be taken regarding quarantines, mask wearing, and lockdowns. Initially, Fauci and Birx, motivated by a shortage of masks, assured the public that masks were not necessary. This, however, would turn out to be untrue, as once masks became readily available, they immediately changed their message to the more accurate one of masks being highly effective and necessary. President Trump, however, would continue to repeatedly contradict the scientists, particularly Fauci. Trump would repeatedly go against the facts of the effectiveness of masks. and he would also repeatedly insist that the pandemic would end by Easter. It would not, and the US would quickly become the country officially hit worst by COVID, rivaled possibly only by India. Spanish flu's origins were most likely from a farm in Kansas, most likely originated from the US rather than China. However, its origins still remain ambiguous to this day. The flu started off rather mild and spread to military bases across the state as men shipped off to war in Europe. The time of emergence was during the Great Spring Offensive by Germany. Military bases were overcrowded and men were packed in tight quarters together. They were shipped in cramped trains and boats and stayed in dirty, disease-ridden trenches. A perfect breeding ground for a pandemic. Now, both pandemics had similarity in their spread in that the continued emerging interconnectedness of the modern world contributed significantly to the global spread. The flu spread fast, overtaking most of the planet within a few months, and even impacting battles during the war. The first wave was mild, and press reporting on it was completely muzzled due to wartime propaganda. In a bit of a mirror image to President Trump, President Woodrow Wilson would also constantly downplay the severity of the pandemic, insisting that we continue to get the war machine running. Public health officials begged politicians and war officials, generals, to pause the production and the draft, but they would be ignored. And as a result, soldiers on the front and at home would suffer tremendously because of the virus. Countries all over the world reflected the sentiment of the US, never reporting accurately on the disease and contradicting themselves constantly when it came to the danger that it posed. So in essence, both pandemics became more severe than necessary as a result of government and political misinformation. Misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic was also propagated heavily by politicians, including the president. And during both pandemics, state officials and representatives would constantly spread conflicting and contradictory information in a knowing attempt to downplay the pandemic. The key difference here is that misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic was far more decentralized. Throughout every country which saw waves of COVID-19 misinformation, it was through politicians and actors utilizing the internet and radicalizing random individuals. Meanwhile, Spanish flu misinformation during the pandemic was directly and completely propagated by the state because of the wartime effort. Except for Spain, because they were a neutral country and therefore could report accurately on it. Thus the name Spanish flu, despite the flu not originating from Spain. The viruses themselves, being different, also led to a major discrepancy in reporting. By the deadly second wave, misinformation on the flu became hard to propagate, even though public officials would continue to mismanage and downplay the pandemic. By that point, the public had become aware of the danger it posed. However, with COVID-19, the public was immediately aware of the danger it posed, but misinformation continued to spread division and sow confusion throughout the longevity of the pandemic. In terms of policies of how countries handle the respective viruses and how people behave, in many ways things were scarily similar to now. In other ways, they could not be more different. Let's start with similarities. Most similarities would be found in the US, as both COVID and the Spanish flu in the response was left mainly to the individual states to manage, and responses were heavily varied, with conservative red states often attempting to remove lockdown measures early, disincentivize mask wearing, and later attempt to disincentivize vaccine mandates for business. These sorts of policies were undertaken because of two main motivations. One, the political officials genuinely believed the pandemic would run its course, or wasn't bad enough to necessitate lockdowns, or a quarantine, despite all the news saying otherwise. Or these officials knew how bad the virus was, but believed that the service economy needed to keep rolling no matter what. Of course, another one would be simply political clout to ensure that the failing economy during the pandemic would not be associated with the president who was running for re-election. However, another parallel that can be found with Spanish flu is that it was also left to the states. During the Spanish flu pandemic, unlike in current times, the federal government did give aid through stimulus and through aid to small businesses. Regardless, in many states, countries, and public officials demonstrated that they valued continuing the same levels of economic production or other forms of labor over the lives of the people who would need to be working during the pandemic, while others demonstrated the opposite sentiment, willing to shut down everything to flatten the curve. With the Spanish flu, there were numerous states and countries, far more than now, that not only wanted but required, mandated, presented it as life and death for the country, that the war effort, that the war industry kept moving, that the soldiers keep getting drafted and shipped, no matter what that would mean for the human cost of simply allowing the virus to run amok. The negligence during the Spanish flu was far greater, but examples of both time periods operated under the same principle, placing short-term interests of the state and the economy over the health of people within the country. During COVID, the federal government in America did step in occasionally, passing large stimulus to help Americans. During the Spanish flu, the federal government did nothing as they were way too focused on the war effort. The result in both cases was mass confusion over what needed to be done to curb the spread, leading to political and social instability as some groups claimed that the economy or war machine needed to operate unrestricted, while others rightfully stated so that doing that would lead to far greater spread of the disease. Major takeaway here is that in both pandemics, oftentimes states or politicians would place great short-term economic or political goals over the long-term health of their citizens. With COVID, America utilized a sort of hands-off approach and only used some federal intervention. America currently has 1 million officially counted COVID deaths, and the number is expected to be higher. India was also ravaged by the pandemic as the Prime Minister Narendra Modi also refused to implement significant measures to curb the spread, declaring falsely that COVID-19 that India had dodged the pandemic. They could not be more wrong, as the wave of COVID that blasted through India killed an estimated 4 million people. In COVID, in comparison with the Spanish flu, America's hands-off state approach, along with its refusal to curb the war effort for the sake of public health, would kill off 675,000 Americans, proportionally far higher than COVID due to the deadlier nature of the virus following the second mutation. With COVID, Indian deaths are estimated to be up to 4 million, which is of course devastating, but during the Spanish flu, 20 million Indians died. It's also important to note that this video will be rather America-centric in talking about how countries dealt with the pandemic. But there is a difference to be noted here, a major difference. During the Spanish flu, most countries followed this hands-off approach, with their federal governments refusing to intervene or do much to really help the people during the disease outbreaks. But during COVID-19, a lot of governments, particularly in Europe and in Southeast Asia, as well as most of East Asia, would implement greater measures to curb the spread. As such, a lot of these countries saw far less death than countries such as the US, whereas during the Spanish flu, a lot of countries suffered just as much, if not far more, deaths than the US. A major aspect of both pandemics was conspiracy. Beginning with COVID, immediately throughout 2020, there were large sporadic protests auguring against lockdowns to stop the spread of COVID. And these rallies consisted of large numbers of people arguing against the notion of wearing masks, often citing false conspiratorial information, mainly from sites such as Facebook and other heavily right-leaning websites. These rallies were almost universally consisting of Republican voters and were immediately endorsed and supported by Republican politicians and the President, Donald Trump, who argued against state lockdowns and continued to be contradictory on masks. The result of this was a significant portion of the population refused to follow COVID guidelines and would help prolong the pandemic. Right-wing groups like this could be found in many countries, and oftentimes entire countries would reflect this sentiment. Anti-science advocacy is integral to the divisions soured by the COVID pandemic. Now let's compare it to the Spanish flu. Unsurprisingly, 100 years ago, quite similar things happened. In America, now given that it was a wartime, the anti-science, anti-mask, anti-preventative measure movement was not split down party lines like it was during COVID, but it rather existed as their own political entity, as both parties in America were all in on the war effort and therefore perfectly okay with spreading misinformation and downplaying the pandemic. The real class of information during the Spanish flu was not Republicans versus Democrats like it was during COVID-19. It was mainly scientists and the state and the military-industrial complex. Both pandemics also saw a surge of racial unrest globally. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we got some of the largest protests in history of the U.S. under the banner of Black Lives Matter, protesting police brutality and systemic injustice. 2020 was a time of acknowledging realities that existed within the American system that tend to put minorities on the back foot. As example of how COVID furthered that resentment, death rates within the black community during COVID-19 was far greater than that of the white community, as another example of systemic racism and how economic disparity led to a greater influence of the public health of these minority communities. You notice a trend here of conflicts in COVID-19 split between left liberal versus right wing, whereas conflicts during the Spanish flu were all over the place in terms of politics. Speaking of the Spanish flu, there were plenty of racial conflict during the pandemic, many of which was not even because of the flu itself, it was because of racial conflicts that existed during the early 20th century, a time of, unlike 2020, far greater racism, that was far greater openly accepted racism. There was major conflict between colonial and officials in the British Raj and Indians over medicine, aid, and help to the people in India, based mainly on Anglo-racism against Indians. Another example is South Africa placed another brick on the rising wall of apartheid as white citizens blamed black citizens for being dirty and implementing laws requiring health screenings in order for black Americans to enter in order for black Americans to allow to enter cities, furthering the inequality that was seen during the time of apartheid during South Africa. In America, oftentimes racial tensions would also come to a head, exacerbated by the terrible conditions the pandemic left people in, leading to lynchings, riots, and civil unrest. The key difference in the effects on both pandemics is that when it came to race relations, it was the COVID-19 pandemic that caused many to reflect on and try to ameliorate existing inequalities, while the Spanish flu simply gave people in power the excuse to further those inequalities. When looking at history, it's always important to see parallels, as looking to the past can provide us value. Now let us look at how both of these pandemics ended. The Spanish flu pandemic never ended because of a vaccine. Simply put, the virus ran out of people to kill, and it simply lost steam by the third wave and the fourth wave. The third wave and fourth wave were less deadly, though the third wave was still quite terrible for many people. The fourth wave was very mild, and although it caused a panic, did not lead to any significant suffering. COVID-19, however, despite creating a vaccine, would see a burgeoning anti-vax movement, and thus, through mutations in the virus because of disparities between the vaccine distribution of wealthy Western countries and poor countries in the global South, meant that the virus would mutate and form variants that could bypass the protections offered by the vaccine, and thus meant that the distributors and manufacturers of the vaccine would now need to catch up and develop versions of the vaccine that could tackle these new variants. Because of this, the COVID-19 pandemic, despite what some government officials say, has not ended. It's important to acknowledge that it is never one-to-one, though. Despite these parallels, you may have noticed that these two respective pandemics, we, the ones living in the COVID pandemic, are living in a unique time. Period with its own problems, technology, and issues that aren't found in the past. But like many things, they also exist as developments from the past, and we can look to the past to find out how to fix the issues that exist in the present. I would hope that we do the same with the next pandemic, when it comes rolling around eventually. I would hope that we look to COVID-19, the failures that existed during this pandemic, to maybe help us do better in that next one, because it will come. Another pandemic always arrives. All that matters is how we choose to respond to it.